settle in comfortably. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to decide. Just let the day loosen its grip, one slow breath at a time. Tonight, we're not going to talk about famous battles, heroic kings, or loud turning points. Instead, we're going to drift through something much quieter, something far more powerful. The medieval world did not change because someone planned it to. It changed because people made small mistakes, and then lived with them. Mistakes that felt harmless, mistakes that felt normal, mistakes that happened so slowly, no one thought to stop them. And yet, those quiet errors reshaped how people worked, believed, governed, and survived. They changed history without ever announcing themselves. History often feels like a chain of grand decisions made by kings, generals, and visionaries. Yet some of the most powerful turns in medieval history came not from bold plans, but from quiet mistakes, small misjudgments, misunderstandings, and unintended consequences that slowly reshaped societies. When medieval scribes copied texts by hand, a single misplaced word or mistranslation could alter theology, law, or science for centuries. As seen when ancient medical or astronomical knowledge passed through Arabic and Latin translations, and returned to Europe subtly changed, sometimes less accurate, sometimes oddly transformed. A famous example is the medieval belief in spontaneous generation, reinforced by faulty readings of classical authors like Aristotle, which delayed biological understanding well into the Renaissance. In politics, rulers often underestimated how fragile alliances really were. The Norman conquest itself was partly enabled by diplomatic ambiguity, as promises about succession were made casually and later denied, allowing William the Conqueror to justify invasion based on what may have been a loosely interpreted oath. Religious life, too, was shaped by error as much as devotion. During the early medieval period, the Church struggled to standardize doctrine across Europe, and mistakes in calculating the date of Easter led to fierce disputes between Roman and Celtic Christians, fracturing unity not because of belief, but because of calendars and mathematics. Even timekeeping itself was a problem. Inaccurate calendars slowly drifted from the solar year, meaning religious festivals no longer aligned with seasons. A quiet error that affected agriculture, fasting cycles, and social rhythms for generations. One of the most dramatic medieval miscalculations was the repeated underestimation of disease. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, many authorities believed it was caused by corrupted air or divine punishment, and cities responded with prayer and processions that ironically helped spread infection further. Quarantine, now a basic public health tool, was invented almost accidentally in places like Venice, where officials guessed that isolating ships for 40 days might help, choosing the number more for biblical symbolism than medical science. Yet, this imperfect solution saved countless lives and permanently changed how societies responded to epidemics. Warfare was equally shaped by quiet mistakes. Medieval generals often misread terrain or weather, leading to devastating losses as heavy cavalry charged into mud or narrow passes, unsuited to horses, gradually teaching Europe that infantry and long-range weapons mattered more than noble lineage. The English longbow, for example, rose to dominance, not because knights welcomed it, but because repeated battlefield failures forced reluctant acceptance of a weapon that overturned social hierarchies. Economic history, too, turned on errors that no one initially recognized as such. Feudal obligations were often vaguely defined, and over time these ambiguities allowed peasants to negotiate, resist, or reinterpret duties. Especially after population collapse from plague created labour shortages, what began as sloppy record, keeping slowly undermined rigid feudal control and nudged Europe toward wage labour and early capitalism. Even exploration was driven by medieval miscalculations. European scholars underestimated the size of the earth based on selective readings of classical texts, a mistake that later encouraged westward voyages in the belief that Asia was closer than it truly was, setting the stage for global encounters that reshaped the world. In monasteries, meaning efforts to preserve knowledge sometimes distorted it. Monks copied diagrams they did not fully understand, turning symbolic illustrations into literal interpretations which affected medieval medicine, geography, and cosmology. Maps placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, not because of evidence, but because of spiritual assumption, reinforcing a worldview where theology guided geography. Language itself evolved through error, as Latin fractured into regional dialects, partly because priests and officials mispronounced or simplified words to be understood by local populations, eventually giving rise to modern European languages. Legal systems were no less vulnerable. Medieval judges relied on precedent copied from older cases, and small misunderstandings hardened into law, embedding mistakes into legal tradition where they persisted for centuries. Perhaps most striking is how medieval people often failed to recognize change while it was happening. Incremental shifts in technology, such as the adoption of the stirrup, the heavy plough, or watermills, were not celebrated as revolutions. Yet they quietly transformed warfare, agriculture, and productivity, redistributing power away from old elites. These mistakes and oversights were rarely dramatic in the moment. They unfolded slowly, hidden in daily routines, copied manuscripts, habitual prayers, and administrative shortcuts. Yet over time they accumulated, bending the course of history, as surely as any famous battle or coronation. Medieval history, when viewed closely, is less a story of flawless tradition and more a human record of trial, error, and unintended consequences, reminding us that the past was shaped not only by what people meant to do, but by what they misunderstood, miscalculated, or simply got wrong, and in doing so, quietly built the foundations of the modern world. The medieval world was built on repetition of rituals, texts, traditions, and assumptions. And this repetition meant that even the smallest mistake, once introduced, could echo across centuries without being questioned. One such quiet error lay in education itself. Medieval universities relied heavily on authoritative texts, especially Aristotle and Galen. But questioning these authorities was discouraged. When earlier scholars misinterpreted a passage or drew an incorrect conclusion, later generations treated those errors as settled truth. Medical students learned that illness was caused by imbalances of humours, not because it consistently worked, but because the framework had been inherited unquestioned. As a result, treatments like bloodletting continued long after evidence of harm appeared, shaping health outcomes across Europe. In governance, medieval rulers often misunderstood the limits of their own power. Kings issued charters and privileges casually, sometimes to gain short-term loyalty or funds, without realizing that these documents would later be used to restrict royal authority. The Magna Carta itself emerged partly from such accumulated misunderstandings, where nobles interpreted earlier concessions as permanent rights. Communication delays made matters worse. Decisions were made on outdated information, and by the time corrections arrived, events had already unfolded beyond control. A rebellion might be crushed in one region, while being unintentionally encouraged in another, because a messenger arrived weeks too late. Geography was another realm shaped by error. Medieval travellers relied on second-hand descriptions and exaggerated tales hardened into accepted fact. Entire regions were believed to be filled with monsters or impassable obstacles, discouraging exploration and trade for generations. These imagined dangers influenced political borders and economic routes, meaning prosperity flowed not where it should have, but where fear allowed. In religion, intentioned copying mistakes in sacred texts subtly altered meaning. A single mistranslated word could shift doctrine, influence sermons, and shape moral expectations for millions. The Latin Vulgate Bible contained small ambiguities that theologians debated endlessly, sometimes splitting communities over differences born from grammar rather than belief. The Crusades themselves were fueled in part by oversimplified or misunderstood messages, where distant lands and peoples were reduced to symbols of threat or salvation. Ordinary people, lacking access to full context, acted on these distorted narratives with absolute conviction. Technology spread unevenly because of cultural misjudgment. Innovations like eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, and improved ship designs were initially dismissed in some regions as unnecessary or untrustworthy, delaying their benefits. When mechanical clocks began regulating monastic prayer schedules, time itself became more rigid and abstract, reshaping labor, discipline, and social expectations without anyone consciously deciding that life should be ruled by hours and minutes. Even agriculture suffered from quiet mistakes. Crop rotation systems were adopted inconsistently, and misunderstandings about soil exhaustion led to famines that were blamed on divine anger rather than human mismanagement. Climate fluctuations like the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age were not recognized as natural cycles, so societies failed to adapt proactively, compounding hardship. In warfare, commanders clung to outdated tactics out of tradition, not effectiveness. Heavy armor persisted even as weapons capable of piercing it improved, resulting in unnecessary losses before doctrine slowly caught up with reality. Social hierarchies were reinforced by assumptions rather than evidence. Nobles believed birth equaled competence, while skilled commoners were overlooked until repeated failures forced reluctant change. Trade networks also evolved through error. Merchants misjudged demand, overvalued exotic goods, or misunderstood foreign customs, sometimes triggering economic collapses in states that depended too heavily on a single trade route. Yet these failures also forced diversification, accidentally strengthening long-term economies. Perhaps the most profound medieval mistake was the belief that the world was largely unchanging, because change was seen as decay. Another quiet medieval mistake lay in assuming that familiarity meant safety. What people knew well felt less dangerous than what they did not, even when familiarity concealed risk. Wells were trusted despite contamination, streets were reused despite fire hazards, and routines were followed despite repeated harm. Danger that arrived slowly was normalized, while sudden change was feared. This bias shaped survival strategies. People learned to endure known suffering, rather than risk unknown solutions. Over centuries, this produced incremental change, small safety measures layered onto familiar systems, rather than bold redesign. Progress emerged not by abandoning the familiar, but by quietly reshaping it from within. There was also a misunderstanding of authority's memory. Medieval institutions believed they remembered their own past accurately, yet records were partial, biased, or lost. Decisions were justified by precedent that was misunderstood or selectively recalled. This distorted memory shaped law and governance, locking in interpretations that suited present needs rather than historical reality. Over time, contradictions accumulated until memory itself became suspect. The slow expansion of record, keeping archives and verification arose not from love of accuracy, but from repeated embarrassment when remembered precedent failed to match reality. Another subtle error involved the belief that problems belonged to places rather than processes. Famine was seen as the fault of unlucky regions, crime as the nature of certain neighborhoods, unrest as the character of particular peoples. This localized blame obscured systemic causes. Solutions focused on control rather than reform, yet repeated recurrence forced recognition that problems traveled along trade routes, policies, and habits. This realization did not arrive as theory, it arrived as fatigue. When the same problems appeared everywhere, place-based explanations lost credibility, opening space for structural thinking. Medieval societies also misunderstood how deeply incentives shaped behavior. Rules were written assuming obedience came from duty or fear, not from alignment of interest. When rules failed, disobedience was moralized rather than analyzed. Over time, repeated enforcement failures taught a practical lesson. People comply more when rules work with their needs. Wages replaced obligations, contracts replaced oaths, and negotiated terms replaced fixed dues. These changes were framed as necessity, not insight. Yet they transformed social organization. Another quiet mistake lay in how medieval people treated exceptions. Exceptions were tolerated as rare deviations rather than signals of change. When too many exceptions accumulated, the rule itself lost meaning. But this erosion was slow and unnoticed. People continued to speak as if the rule held, even as daily life contradicted it. Eventually, the rule was rewritten or quietly abandoned long after it had ceased to function. Reform lagged behind reality, giving the impression of sudden change when recognition finally caught up. Medieval people also misunderstood how deeply environment shapes culture. Customs were treated as moral choices rather than adaptations to land, climate, and resources. When environments changed, through deforestation, climate shifts, or urban growth, customs struggled to keep pace. Instead of adjusting openly, societies layered meaning onto outdated practices. Over time, the mismatch became too costly. Adaptation followed, disguised as tradition. Culture survived by changing while pretending not to. Another subtle error lay in assuming that scale magnified solutions. What worked well in small communities was assumed to work better when expanded. In reality, scale changed everything. Trust weakened, oversight failed, and personal knowledge disappeared. Medieval attempts to govern large territories using village logic produced corruption and fragmentation. These failures slowly taught the need for specialization, delegation, and abstraction. Bureaucracy emerged not from love of order, but from the repeated collapse of overextended simplicity. Medieval societies also misjudged how long recovery truly takes. After disaster, survival was mistaken for recovery. Fields replanted, Walls rebuilt, rituals resumed, life continued. Yet underlying damage lingered: trauma, debt, lost skills, weakened trust, because these effects were invisible. They were ignored. Over generations, compounded recovery gaps reshaped populations and institutions. Later historians saw decline or transformation, without seeing the long shadow of incomplete healing behind it. Another quiet misunderstanding involved generosity. Charity was praised, but it was assumed to flow endlessly from personal virtue. When demand outpaced capacity, generosity collapsed unevenly, breeding resentment. This failure forced the creation of organized support, hospitals, poor relief, communal funds, not because compassion increased, but because reliance on individual virtue proved unsustainable. Institutional care emerged from the limits of personal goodness, not from its abundance. Medieval people also misunderstood how deeply tools shape thought. Writing changed memory, clocks changed time, money changed obligation. These tools were adopted for convenience, not foresight. Their deeper effects unfolded slowly. People adapted their thinking to the tool rather than questioning the tool's influence. Over time, new assumptions felt natural. The medieval world changed not because people chose new ways of thinking, but because new tools quietly trained them to think differently. Another persistent error lay in equating silence with peace. Quiet periods were assumed stable, even when tensions simmered beneath. Silence masked negotiation, fear, and exhaustion. When unrest finally surfaced, it felt explosive. Authorities blamed sudden disobedience rather than long endurance. Over time, this misreading forced new ways of listening: petitions, councils, representation, though always reluctantly. Voice emerged not from empowerment, but from the failure of silence to guarantee stability. Medieval people also misunderstood how deeply repetition teaches. Lessons learned once were easily forgotten. Lessons lived repeatedly became habit. This is why change arrived through routine rather than revelation. Fields planted differently, contracts written slightly clearer, tools adjusted marginally. Each repetition reinforced adaptation. Over centuries, repetition built structures stronger than ideas ever could. Another quiet mistake involved the belief that knowledge belonged to individuals rather than systems. When skilled people died, their knowledge died with them. Over time, this loss forced the creation of systems that outlived individuals: guilds, manuals, offices. These systems did not emerge from generosity. They emerged from grief and frustration. Losing the same knowledge too many times made preservation unavoidable. Medieval societies also misunderstood how much trust depends on predictability. Trust was framed as moral character rather than reliable behavior. When good intentions failed, trust collapsed. Over time, predictability, regular wages, consistent rules, scheduled markets proved more trustworthy than virtue. This shifted social organization away from personal morality toward dependable systems, quietly changing how trust was built. Another subtle error lay in treating adaptation as temporary. Changes made during crisis were expected to be reversed afterward. Yet many crisis adaptations worked better than old norms. Instead of reverting, people kept them quietly. What began as emergency measure became custom. Because this transition was unannounced, it avoided resistance. crisis acted as cover for experimentation. Medieval people also misunderstood how deeply boredom shapes innovation. Repetition without improvement bred quiet dissatisfaction. People tinkered not to transform society, but to make daily life tolerable. Small comforts, efficiencies, and shortcuts accumulated. These modest changes, driven by boredom rather than ambition, altered productivity and expectation over time. Perhaps the most enduring medieval mistake was believing that history required intention. People expected the future to be shaped by plans, prophecies, or decisive acts. In reality, the future emerged from countless unplanned adjustments. Medieval people lived forward without seeing backward. They did not know which actions mattered. That ignorance freed them to act pragmatically rather than ideologically. History changed because medieval people responded to immediate needs without understanding long-term consequences. Their mistakes were ordinary, their corrections partial, their intentions limited. Yet those small responses layered over time reshaped everything: work, power, belief, and community. The medieval world did not advance by solving its problems. It advanced by living with them long enough to discover what could no longer be tolerated. Each generation inherited unresolved errors and added its own adjustments together. These layers formed the foundation of the modern world. What appears to us as a distant, static age was in fact a slow, continuous process of trial and endurance. Medieval history was written not in sudden breakthroughs, but in quiet persistence. Mistakes were made, absorbed, adjusted, and passed on. And through that long endurance, through lives lived under imperfect assumptions, the course of history bent, gradually and irrevocably, towards something new. Another quiet medieval mistake was the belief that small problems could safely remain small. Minor cracks in walls, slight disputes over land, modest debts, and occasional corruption were tolerated because they did not yet threaten survival. Medieval people often believed that attention should be saved for great crises, not everyday flaws. Yet these small problems accumulated. Cracks widened, disputes hardened into feuds, debts changed generations, and corruption normalized itself into custom. When collapse finally came, it appeared sudden, but it was only the visible moment of a long-ignored build-up. The correction of this mistake did not come through vigilance, but through exhaustion, when the weight of neglected detail became too heavy to carry. There was also a misunderstanding of how habits outlast explanations. Medieval people changed their stories faster than their routines. A belief might shift, a doctrine evolve, or a law be rewritten, yet daily behavior continued almost unchanged. This created a lag where people lived one way and explained it another. Instead of causing chaos, this lag created space for adaptation. New meanings slowly attached themselves to old habits. The mistake of assuming explanation-controlled behavior allowed behavior to change first, smoothing transitions that might otherwise have sparked resistance. Another subtle error lay in the assumption that strength was visible. Power was associated with force, wealth, and authority, while flexibility, cooperation, and patience were undervalued. Yet the most resilient communities were often those that bent quietly rather than resisted loudly. They adjusted rents informally, shared risk, diversified labour, and tolerated ambiguity. These strategies lacked prestige and left little record, but they preserved life. Over time, What had been dismissed as weakness became institutionalized as policy, law, and structure. The medieval failure to recognize quiet strength allowed it to grow unchecked. Medieval societies also misunderstood how knowledge ages. They believed old knowledge was superior simply because it had endured. Age became a proxy for truth. This discouraged testing, but encouraged preservation. Ironically, preservation kept ideas available long enough to be questioned later. Had medieval people discarded old knowledge more aggressively, much would have been lost entirely. Their mistake was not reverence itself, but assuming reverence guaranteed accuracy. Over centuries, preservation and correction worked together, even though they seemed opposed. Another quiet misunderstanding involved belonging. Community membership was treated as natural and fixed, yet it was constantly negotiated. Who counted as insider or outsider shifted through marriage, migration, conversion, and economic need. Because these shifts were gradual, communities believed their identity was stable, even as it changed. Conflict erupted when identity was enforced rigidly, revealing how much flexibility had existed before. The medieval belief in fixed belonging masked a reality of constant adjustment. Medieval people also misjudged how innovation survives hostility. New ideas rarely replaced old ones directly. Instead, they hid within them. New practices were framed as ancient, reforms described as restorations, and changes justified through familiar language. This strategy allowed innovation to spread without provoking fear. The mistake of equating novelty with danger forced creativity into disguise. But that disguise made it durable. By the time novelty was recognized, it was already tradition. Another persistent error lay in how medieval societies understood limits. Natural limits of land, labor, health, and endurance were often discovered only through suffering. People pushed systems until they broke, then retreated slightly. This created a pattern of oscillation rather than steady improvement. Yet oscillation taught boundaries. Over generations, societies learned how far systems could be stretched before collapse. These lessons were not written as theory, they were embedded in custom, law, and expectation. Medieval attitudes toward coordination also carried quiet consequences. Large-scale cooperation was seen as risky and unnatural. Trust was local, suspicion distant. This limited ambition but preserved autonomy. When coordination became unavoidable during war, plague, or famine, it was improvised under pressure. These improvisations revealed what coordination could achieve, but also its dangers. Over time, medieval societies learned to balance local trust with broader organization, not through planning, but through repeated crisis. Another misunderstanding involved speed. Medieval people expected change to be slow and danger to be sudden. In reality, danger often built slowly, while change arrived gradually. This reversal-shaped response. People were unprepared for long-term decline but adaptable to sudden shock. Over time, repeated long declines, soil exhaustion, demographic pressure, institutional decay, forced recognition that slow change mattered. This realization transformed planning, even as it was rarely articulated. Medieval people also misunderstood how deeply emotion shaped reason. Decisions were framed as rational or spiritual, but fear, honor, shame, and hope drove behavior more powerfully than doctrine. Because emotion was not openly acknowledged, its influence was misunderstood. Policies failed because they ignored emotional reality. Over centuries, societies learned, by repeated failure, that stability required addressing feelings as well as facts. Rituals, symbols, and customs evolved to manage emotion quietly, shaping governance as much as law did. Another quiet mistake lay in assuming that tools only changed efficiency, not relationships. New tools altered who depended on whom, who controlled time, and who held power. Yet these social effects were rarely anticipated. When watermills spread, they reorganized labor and ownership. When written records expanded, they shifted authority from memory to documentation. Each tool carried social consequences disguised as technical improvement. Medieval people adopted tools for practical reasons, only later living with their deeper effects. Perhaps the most enduring medieval mistake was believing that history moved through intention. People expected deliberate acts, crowning, conquest, reform, to define eras. They did not see everyday adjustment as historical force. This blindness allowed change to occur without resistance. Because people did not recognize themselves as historical agents, they acted freely within constraints. Their freedom was limited, but it was enough. The medieval world changed because people responded to what was immediately in front of them: hunger, danger, obligation, opportunity. They solved local problems without knowing they were contributing to larger patterns. Their mistakes were repeated, shared, and slowly corrected, not erased. Each correction left residue, altering the next attempt. In the end, medieval history is not a story of people who failed to understand their world, but of people who understood just enough to survive it. Their misunderstandings were not obstacles to progress. They were the medium through which progress occurred. By living inside imperfect systems and adjusting them piece by piece, medieval societies reshaped law, labor, belief, and power without ever naming the transformation. History did not change because medieval people finally got it right. It changed because they kept going while being partly wrong. And in that long endurance, marked by quiet mistakes, patient correction, and unintended consequence, the foundations of the modern world were laid, not by design, but by lived experience repeated across generations. Another quiet medieval mistake was the belief that boundaries were clearer than they truly were. Lines between sacred and secular, public and private, lawful and unlawful, were assumed to be fixed, yet daily life constantly blurred them. A lord's household was both family and government. A church was both spiritual refuge and economic center. A market was both social space and legal zone. Because these overlaps were not clearly defined, conflicts arose not from deliberate transgression, but from misunderstanding. Instead of resolving the ambiguity, medieval society lived inside it, improvising case by case. Over time, these improvisations hardened into distinctions that later generations would treat as obvious, even though they had emerged from centuries of confusion rather than clarity. There was also a misunderstanding of protection. Authorities believed that control created safety, while communities often found safety in flexibility. Strict rules promised order, but rigid systems shattered under stress. Flexible arrangements bent and survived. Because flexibility looked disorderly, it was undervalued. Yet it was this quiet adaptability, unwritten agreements, informal aid, tolerated exceptions, that carried people through repeated crises. Only much later did formal systems begin to incorporate flexibility, learning from what had already worked in practice. Medieval people also misjudged the permanence of solutions. When a problem was solved once, the solution was treated as final. Little attention was paid to changing conditions. A wall that stopped one raid was trusted forever. A treaty that ended one conflict was assumed durable. A law that addressed one injustice was applied endlessly. Over time, these fixed solutions became mismatched to reality. Their failure forced constant patching. This cycle taught slowly and painfully that solutions age. Modern ideas of revision, review, and reform emerged, not from foresight, but from repeated disappointment in permanent answers. Another subtle error lay in how medieval societies understood responsibility. Responsibility was often collective in theory, but individual in consequence. Another quiet medieval mistake lay in how people misunderstood predictability. They believed the world followed patterns that could be trusted simply because they had repeated before. Seasons would arrive on time, rulers would behave as tradition dictated, and neighbours would act according to custom. When these expectations failed, the failure was treated as anomaly rather than signal. This encouraged societies to prepare for the familiar instead of the possible. Over time, repeated surprises, forced subtle shifts, extra reserves, backup alliances, layered authority. But these were framed as prudence, not acknowledgement that the old certainty was flawed. What slowly emerged was a culture of contingency, built without ever naming uncertainty as a governing principle. There was also a deep misunderstanding of substitution. Medieval people assumed that if one resource failed, another could simply replace it. When forests thinned, they cut deeper. When soil tired, they expanded fields. When labour declined, they worked harder. This logic delayed collapse, but intensified strain. Only after substitution failed repeatedly did societies begin to change methods rather than inputs. Crop rotation, alternative fuels, and wage incentives emerged not from foresight, but from the exhaustion of replacing one depleted thing with another. Another quiet error involved memory of success. Victories, military, political, or economic, were remembered far more vividly than failures. Successful strategies became myths, repeated long after conditions had changed. Losses were explained away as betrayal, bad luck, or divine testing. This selective memory created overconfidence. Generals reused outdated tactics. Rulers copied policies that had once worked, and communities clung to stories of past prosperity. Each repetition increased the cost of eventual failure. When correction came, it often came brutally, forcing societies to relearn humility through loss rather than reflection. Medieval societies also misunderstood the role of maintenance. Building was celebrated, upkeep was ignored. Castles, roads, and institutions were created with great ceremony, then quietly left to decay. Maintenance lacked prestige and clear ownership. This neglect created cycles of crisis repair, where systems were allowed to fail dramatically before being restored. Over time, people learned slowly that constant small effort was cheaper than heroic rebuilding. The rise of routine inspection, dues for upkeep, and permanent offices of maintenance marked a shift in mindset born entirely from repeated neglect. Another subtle mistake lay in how medieval people interpreted silence. Silence from authority was assumed to mean approval. Silence from communities was assumed to mean consent. In reality, Silence often meant confusion, fear, or lack of alternatives. This misreading allowed harmful practices to persist long after they were privately questioned. When voices finally emerged, they sounded radical because they broke long, standing quiet. Authorities were often shocked by dissent, not because it was new, but because they had mistaken endurance for agreement. The medieval understanding of obligation to the future was also limited. Responsibility was felt strongly toward ancestors and contemporaries, but weakly toward descendants. Decisions were made to honor the past or survive the present, rarely to protect what came next. This shaped land use, inheritance, and governance. Over time, the cumulative damage of short-term thinking became visible. Slowly, practices emerged that extended concern forward: trusts, endowments, long-term leases, not because people became future-oriented in belief, but because the cost of ignoring the future became undeniable. Another persistent misunderstanding concerned explanation versus control. Medieval people were skilled at explaining why things happened after the fact, but far less confident in preventing them. Explanation provided comfort, control required change. This imbalance meant societies became rich in meaning but poor in prevention. Over centuries, however, repeated explanation without improvement felt hollow. Gradually, control through planning, regulation, and design shared space with meaning. The world became not less symbolic, but more manageable. Even hospitality reflected quiet error. Generosity was expected and celebrated, but it was assumed to be limitless. Communities overextended themselves during crises, hosting refugees, feeding travelers, supporting dependents beyond capacity. When generosity collapsed under strain, the failure felt moral rather than logistical. Over time, this taught the need for structured aid rather than endless personal sacrifice. Institutions of care replaced informal obligation, not because kindness diminished, but because unbounded generosity proved unsustainable. Medieval people also misunderstood how adaptation spreads emotionally. Change was often resisted, not because it was harmful, but because it disrupted identity. To cope, societies disguised adaptation as continuity, new practices wrapped in old language, reforms framed as restorations. This habit allowed enormous change to occur without triggering panic. The mistake of equating identity with stasis ironically enabled identity to survive transformation. Another quiet error involved the assumption that problems had single causes. When systems failed, people searched for one culprit, one sin, one enemy, one mistake. This simplified blame, but obscured complexity. Over time, repeated failures taught a harder lesson. Many problems persisted because they were layered. Solutions had to be layered too. Medieval societies learned this not through theory, but through accumulation of partial fixes that slowly formed systems. Perhaps the most human medieval mistake was believing that awareness was necessary for change. In reality, most change happened without awareness. People adjusted habits, negotiated boundaries, and altered expectations without naming what they were doing. Awareness often came later, when change was already complete. This lag made history feel sudden in retrospect, even though it had unfolded gradually. In the end, the medieval world teaches that history does not require clear vision to move forward. It requires pressure, response, and the willingness, conscious or not, to adjust. Medieval people were not passive victims of error, nor enlightened architects of progress. They were participants in a long process of learning through living. Their mistakes were quiet because they were ordinary. They happened in kitchens, fields, workshops, courts, and prayers. They were repeated daily, corrected slightly, and passed on. And through that repetition, those mistakes became the most powerful force shaping history. The medieval world did not change because it solved its problems. It changed because it could not ignore them forever. Each generation inherited not only traditions, but unresolved errors. In responding to those errors, imperfectly, cautiously, and often without understanding, people reshaped society step by step. History turned not on moments of certainty, but on long stretches of uncertainty endured. And it was within that uncertainty, lived quietly and continuously, that the medieval world unknowingly prepared the ground for everything that followed. Another quiet medieval mistake lay in how people misunderstood repetition. When something failed once, it was seen as misfortune. When it failed repeatedly, it became routine. Familiar failure was tolerated more easily than unfamiliar solutions. Floods along the same rivers, fires in the same districts, and shortages in the same seasons became accepted rhythms of life. This acceptance reduced panic, but it also dulled urgency. People adapted personally, raising floors, storing food, changing habits, while leaving underlying causes untouched. Over generations, these personal adaptations accumulated into structural change without any single moment of reform. What began as resignation quietly became redesign. Medieval societies also misunderstood negotiation. They treated compromise as weakness, believing firm positions ensured stability. In practice, survival depended on constant negotiation between lord and tenant, city and countryside, merchant and guild, church and lay people. These negotiations were informal, ongoing, and rarely recorded. Because they lacked ceremony, they were underestimated, yet they shaped reality more than official decrees. When formal law finally changed, it often merely acknowledged what negotiation had already made normal. Another subtle error involved the treatment of margins as expendable. Border regions, poor districts, and peripheral communities were expected to absorb risk. Floods, raids, famine, and disease were endured there first. This protected centres of power but created long-term instability. Margins became sites of innovation because necessity forced experimentation. New crops, tools, alliances, and social arrangements emerged there. Quietly, over time, what worked at the edges spread inward. The mistake of neglecting the margins unintentionally turned them into laboratories of change. Medieval people also misunderstood the durability of emotion. Fear, hope, resentment, and loyalty were assumed to fade quickly. In reality, emotions lingered across generations. Trauma from war or famine-shaped parenting, labor habits, and community trust long after events ended. Because emotional memory was not formally acknowledged, its effects were misunderstood. Policies failed because they addressed material conditions while ignoring inherited fear or suspicion. Over time, repeated failure taught that stability required emotional repair as well as material provision, though this lesson was learnt slowly and unevenly. Another quiet misunderstanding lay in how medieval societies viewed equality. Another quiet medieval mistake lay in how people misunderstood continuity. They believed institutions, customs, and beliefs moved smoothly from past to future. when in reality they survived through constant improvisation. Each generation quietly altered what it inherited, usually out of necessity, yet still spoke as if nothing had changed. This illusion of continuity hid transformation so effectively that people resisted reforms they were already living. Laws were obeyed in form but not in spirit. Rituals were performed with altered meanings, and offices continued under names that no longer matched their functions. Because the surface looked familiar, deeper change went unnoticed, allowing society to evolve without triggering fear of rupture. There was also a persistent misunderstanding of effort versus direction. Medieval people worked incredibly hard, but effort was often spent maintaining systems that no longer served their purpose. Enormous labor went into upholding rituals, hierarchies, and obligations that drained resources without solving problems. Because exhaustion was normalized, inefficiency became invisible. Only when labor shortages followed plagues did people begin to ask whether effort itself could be redirected, rather than simply intensified. This quiet questioning shifted focus from endurance to effectiveness, slowly changing how work, time, and value were understood. Another subtle error involved the treatment of rules as moral truths rather than tools. Laws and customs were treated as reflections of cosmic or divine order, not adjustable frameworks. This made reform emotionally difficult, as changing a rule felt like attacking meaning itself. Instead of rewriting rules, people bent them. Exceptions multiplied, loopholes became standard practice, and enforcement grew selective. Over time, the original rule lost relevance, replaced in practice by something more flexible. Reform happened not through revision, but through erosion, until the old structure existed mostly in name. Medieval societies also misunderstood how power actually functioned. Authority was believed to flow downward, from god to king to lord to peasant. In practice, power flowed where cooperation existed. Lords depended on peasants to work land, kings depended on nobles to raise armies, and clergy depended on lay belief. When cooperation weakened, authority hollowed out. Because this dependence was rarely acknowledged, rulers often mistook silence for loyalty. Quiet non-compliance, slow work, hidden goods, selective obedience, reshaped power relations long before revolts ever occurred. Another quiet mistake lay in confusing rarity with value. Exotic goods, rare texts, and distant knowledge were often prized over practical local solutions. This skewed attention away from everyday improvements. People admired what was difficult to obtain rather than what reliably worked. Yet survival depended on the ordinary tools that did not break, crops that endured, agreements that held. Over time, repeated failures of prestigious solutions forced renewed respect for reliability. What seemed humble gradually became central, shifting values without open debate. Medieval people also misunderstood how fear shaped behavior. Fear was used deliberately to control, but its long-term effects were poorly understood. Fear discouraged reporting problems, sharing information, and experimenting with solutions. People hid mistakes rather than correcting them, allowing small issues to grow. Eventually, the cost of fear became obvious as crises intensified. Gradually, systems emerged that rewarded disclosure, confession, and correction, not from compassion, but from the practical failure of intimidation. Trust became valuable only after fear proved too expensive. There was a deep misunderstanding of how much the unseen future mattered. Planning rarely extended beyond immediate survival, because uncertainty felt overwhelming. This short horizon made societies vulnerable to predictable cycles, winter shortages, flooding seasons, political succession crises. Each recurrence felt new despite familiarity. Over generations, repetition itself taught foresight. Granaries, inheritance laws, and standing institutions emerged not from optimism, but from exhaustion with being surprised by the same problems again and again. Another subtle error involved the belief that explanation reduced suffering. Giving meaning to hardship through religion, fate, or tradition helped people endure, but it also reduced urgency to prevent harm. Explanation replaced investigation. Over time, repeated losses forced a shift. Meaning alone was not enough. Prevention mattered. This did not erase spiritual interpretation, but it slowly shared space with practical response. The balance between meaning and management changed quietly, reshaping how societies handled risk. Medieval people also underestimated how much behavior teaches belief. They assumed belief guided action when often action reshaped belief. People adopted new tools, habits, and arrangements for practical reasons, then later adjusted their explanations to fit what they were already doing. This reversal made change feel less threatening. Belief followed practice, not the other way around. The mistake of assuming ideas allowed behavior to change freely, carrying society forward without ideological conflict. Another overlooked misunderstanding was about loss itself. Loss was treated as failure rather than information. When something disappeared, a skill, a crop, a population, it was mourned, not studied. This delayed learning. Yet repeated losses carved patterns into memory. Eventually, societies learned not from single disasters, but from their accumulation. Knowledge emerged slowly, embedded in habit rather than theory. Perhaps the quietest medieval mistake was believing that history belonged to others. Ordinary people did not see themselves as participants in shaping the future. They acted locally, personally, pragmatically. Yet history was made precisely through those actions, through how people responded to pressure, scarcity, fear, and opportunity. The lack of historical self-awareness allowed adaptation without self-consciousness. People changed the world because they were not trying to. By the time the medieval period gave way to something recognizably modern, no clear line had been crossed. There was no universal realization, no shared moment of understanding. Instead, there was a long trail of small errors, corrected just enough to continue. Each generation inherited problems, shaped by earlier misunderstandings, and added its own adjustments. The result was transformation without intention. The medieval world did not advance by knowing better. It advanced by surviving worse. Its mistakes were quiet, persistent, and human. They shaped law, labor, belief, power, and daily life, not through sudden insight, but through accumulated experience. History changed because people lived inside error long enough to learn its limits. And from those limits, slowly and almost invisibly, a new world emerged. Another quiet medieval mistake lay in the assumption that balance naturally maintained itself. People believed social order, population levels, and resource use would correct automatically if left alone. When imbalance appeared, it was treated as temporary disturbance rather than a warning. Overpopulation strained land until famine intervened. Labor shortages followed plague until wages rose. These corrections felt cruel and uncontrollable, reinforcing the belief that human intervention mattered little. Yet each crisis subtly altered expectations. Survivors demanded better terms, adjusted family size, or changed land use. Balance did return, but not naturally. It returned because people adapted under pressure, even while believing they had little agency. Medieval societies also misunderstood the difference between resilience and fragility. Systems that survived repeated shocks were assumed to be strong, even when survival depended on constant sacrifice from the most vulnerable. Peasants absorbed famine, workers absorbed danger, women absorbed loss. This hidden buffering made elites believe structures were sound. When buffers finally failed, collapse seemed sudden and inexplicable. The mistake was not cruelty alone, but ignorance of where strain was being absorbed. Over time, recognizing these weak points forced redistribution of risk through wages, protections, and shared responsibility, though never evenly or intentionally. There was a quiet error in how medieval people viewed repair. Fixing something was seen as restoring it to what it had been, not improving it. Broken tools were remade in familiar forms. Damaged systems reassembled as before. Innovation emerged only when repair repeatedly failed. This meant progress was reactive, arriving only after exhaustion. Yet repair culture also created deep familiarity with materials and systems. Craftspeople learned through mending what builders never learned through design. That knowledge, accumulated slowly, eventually transformed production and engineering. Another misunderstanding involved secrecy. Knowledge was often hoarded to preserve status or advantage. Masters guarded techniques, rulers guarded information, institutions guarded records. This seemed prudent, but it made systems brittle. When a single person died, or a single archive burned, knowledge vanished. Repeated loss taught the value of redundancy, copying, and shared learning. The spread of manuals, guild rules, and public records did not arise from generosity, but from the repeated failure of secrecy to protect continuity. Medieval people also misjudged how imitation drives change. Borrowing was seen as inferior to tradition, yet imitation happened constantly, between villages, trades, regions, and cultures. People copied what worked without credit or theory. This quiet borrowing spread improvements faster. Another long-lasting medieval mistake was the belief that preservation meant freezing the past, rather than maintaining usefulness. Objects, texts, and institutions were kept alive even when their original purpose had faded. Laws were repeated verbatim long after the conditions that created them had vanished. Rituals continued even when their meanings were forgotten. This gave medieval society a sense of continuity, but it also trapped people inside inherited solutions to new problems. Yet even here, quiet change crept in. Meanings shifted while words stayed the same. Practices adapted beneath familiar names. What appeared unchanged from the outside often functioned very differently within, allowing society to evolve without admitting that it had altered course. There was also a deep misunderstanding of feedback. Medieval systems responded slowly to failure. When something went wrong, the cause was rarely traced immediately, and the response often addressed symptoms rather than roots. This delay made correction painful, but it also made lessons harder to forget. When famine followed poor storage year after year, the eventual solution was robust, because it was forged through repetition. Fast feedback can create shallow learning. Slow feedback, though costly, created durable adjustment. Medieval societies learned slowly, but once they learned, the change tended to last. Another quiet error lay in confusing uniformity with unity. Authorities believed that shared rules and practices created cohesion, but enforced sameness often produced quiet resistance. Communities complied outwardly while preserving local customs privately. This produced layered societies where official culture and lived culture diverged. Over time, this divergence became a source of resilience. When centralized systems failed, local practices filled the gap. What began as disobedience later appeared as cultural richness, regional identity, and adaptive strength. Medieval people also misunderstood how innovation spreads. They expected change to come from the top kings, scholars, or divine inspiration. In reality, most useful innovation came from necessity at the bottom. Farmers adjusting tools, builders changing techniques, merchants inventing workarounds. Because these changes lacked prestige, they were ignored until they were widespread. When elites finally noticed, they often claimed authorship or codified what already existed. This pattern made innovation seem sudden and authoritative, masking the long period of quiet experimentation beneath it. There was a persistent error in how medieval societies interpreted peace. Peace was defined as the absence of open conflict, not the presence of fairness or stability. As long as fighting stopped, underlying tensions were ignored. This allowed injustices to harden quietly. Resentment accumulated invisibly until it exploded later in ways that seemed irrational or excessive. Medieval people often believed peace had failed suddenly, when in reality it had been fragile all along. The mistake was not failing to stop conflict, but failing to resolve it. Even spirituality was shaped by misunderstanding proportion. Minor sins were sometimes feared more than structural harm. Individuals worried about personal salvation, while institutions perpetuated suffering. This imbalance focused moral energy inward rather than outward. Over time, repeated crises made this focus unsustainable. Gradually, concern shifted toward collective responsibility, charity, and social order. The change did not come from abandoning faith, but from the realization that inward purity alone could not sustain a society. Another quiet mistake was assuming that knowledge naturally flows forward. Medieval people did not expect regression. When skills were lost, they believed they could always be recovered. This confidence proved false again and again. The shock of rediscovering lost techniques, centuries later, slowly taught the value of documentation, redundancy, and teaching beyond immediate need. These practices emerged not from optimism, but from repeated disappointment. Even humor and storytelling played a role. Jokes, fables, and songs carried criticism that formal speech could not. Because they were dismissed as entertainment, their influence was underestimated. Over time, they shaped values, mocked authority, and normalized alternative perspectives. This quiet cultural undercurrent softened rigid hierarchies long before laws changed. What was laughed at became thinkable. What was thinkable eventually became possible. The medieval misunderstanding of inevitability also shaped behavior. People believed many outcomes were fixed: social rank, fortune, fate. This belief reduced anxiety, but it also delayed action. When change finally occurred, it felt miraculous rather than earned. Yet behind every miracle lay generations of small adjustments, compromises, and quiet corrections that made the change possible. In the end, the medieval world was not shaped by a single grand error, but by thousands of small ones lived with patiently. Each mistake narrowed the range of what could be ignored. Each failure taught limits, even when the lesson was not consciously understood. Over centuries, these limits reshaped thought, habit, and structure. The result was transformation without intention, progress without confidence, and a future built not on certainty, but on accumulated experience. History changed quietly because people did not know they were changing it. They were simply responding, adapting, enduring, and adjusting, one small mistake at a time. Another enduring medieval mistake was the belief that survival equaled understanding. As long as a community endured hardship, it assumed its methods were correct, even if survival came at enormous cost. People rebuilt after floods, plagues, and wars, using nearly the same patterns, believing resilience proved wisdom. In reality, endurance often masked inefficiency. Lives were shortened, potential wasted, and suffering normalized, because collapse never came all at once. This gradual drain shaped population growth, innovation, and social structure more powerfully than dramatic disasters ever did. Only when survival itself became uncertain did deeper change begin. And even then it emerged cautiously, disguised as necessity rather than insight. Medieval societies also misunderstood the power of accumulation in negative ways. Small injustices were tolerated because each seemed bearable. A slightly unfair tax, a mildly corrupt official, a marginally abusive labour expectation. None of these sparked revolt alone. Together, over generations, they created a heavy, unseen pressure that bent societies toward instability. When revolts finally occurred, they appeared sudden and irrational to elites who had never felt the weight build. The mistake was not cruelty, but blinds to how minor burdens compound over time. There was also a quiet error in assuming that cultural identity was fixed. People believed customs, language, and belief were stable markers of who they were. Yet identity shifted constantly through trade, intermarriage, migration, and imitation. Because these changes were gradual, they went unnoticed. By the time communities recognized difference, it felt like loss rather than evolution. This misunderstanding fueled conflict, as people fought to preserve identities that had already transformed. What seemed like resistance to change was often resistance to recognizing change that had long since occurred. Medieval governance was further shaped by a misunderstanding of scale in punishment. Harsh penalties were believed to deter wrongdoing, but extreme punishment often reduced cooperation and trust. Communities hid crimes rather than report them, undermining justice. Over time, this forced authorities to soften enforcement, rely on fines, mediation, and restitution. These shifts were practical responses to failure, not moral awakenings. Yet they quietly transformed legal culture, moving it closer to systems based on resolution rather than fear. Another overlooked mistake lay in how medieval people understood prosperity. Wealth was seen as static. One person's gain meant another's loss. This belief discouraged investment and experimentation. Trade was treated with suspicion, innovation with caution. Yet merchants, artisans, and farmers continued to take risks quietly, driven by survival rather than ideology. Their successes slowly disproved the zero-sum view of wealth, even as the belief persisted. By the time societies accepted growth as possible, economic behavior had already changed beneath the surface. Even architecture reflects medieval misunderstanding. Buildings were designed for present needs, rarely for adaptation. As populations grew or functions changed, structures were patched rather than redesigned. These layers of correction created complex, irregular spaces that modern observers romanticize. But they were born from the refusal, or inability, to plan flexibly. Yet these same irregularities made cities adaptable, allowing reuse and modification rather than total replacement. What began as short-sightedness became resilience. Medieval people also underestimated how habits outlive beliefs. Even when ideas changed, routines persisted. People continued to eat, work, worship, and govern in familiar ways long after the reasons had faded. This lag created periods where practice and belief no longer matched. Instead of causing collapse, this mismatch allowed gradual transition. New ideas slipped into old routines, transforming them slowly. The mistake of clinging to habit unintentionally became a bridge between worlds. Another deep misunderstanding concerned visibility. What was seen was treated as important. What was unseen was ignored. Emotional labor, domestic work, and maintenance were undervalued because they left little visible trace. Yet, these unseen efforts held societies together. Another deeply embedded medieval mistake was the belief that complexity itself was dangerous. Simple explanations were preferred over accurate ones, even when reality was clearly more tangled. If a famine occurred, it was easier to blame divine displeasure than to analyze weather patterns, storage systems, or trade failures. This preference for simplicity reduced anxiety, but it also postponed solutions. Problems were treated as singular events instead of interconnected systems. Only after the same disasters repeated across generations did people begin, almost unconsciously, to manage grain reserves, diversify crops, and coordinate relief. These responses were practical, not philosophical. Yet they marked a slow shift towards systemic thinking born from repeated oversimplification. There was also a quiet error in how medieval societies understood ownership. Land, tools, and even offices were treated as extensions of personal identity rather than transferable assets. This blurred line between public and private responsibility caused neglect. Roads decayed, bridges collapsed, and fortifications weakened because no one felt clearly accountable for maintenance. Once the original builder died, these failures accumulated until communities were forced to invent shared responsibility through tolls, taxes, and municipal oversight. What later looked like civic planning emerged, simply because personal ownership proved insufficient for long-term survival. Another overlooked misunderstanding concerned aging and experience. Elders were respected symbolically, but their practical knowledge was not always preserved systematically. Wisdom was assumed to reside naturally in old age, not in record or method. When plagues disproportionately killed older generations, societies lost more than people. They lost memory. The shock of this loss quietly encouraged documentation, manuals, and written instruction. Again, progress came not from valuing writing more, but from the realization that memory alone was fragile. Medieval societies also misjudged the role of failure in learning. Failure was something to hide, justify, or spiritualize, not analyze. Builders blamed collapses on fate, not design. Generals blamed defeat on betrayal, not strategy. This delayed improvement, but it also meant that when patterns of failure became undeniable, change happened rapidly. Once denial collapsed, adaptation followed with surprising speed. The long resistance made the eventual transformation feel abrupt, though it had been prepared by centuries of accumulated evidence. Another subtle error lay in how people understood scarcity. Shortages were treated as temporary interruptions rather than predictable cycles. This encouraged consumption over conservation. Feasts followed harvests even when winter loomed. When scarcity returned, it felt shocking, despite being familiar over time. This pattern forced the development of storage, rationing, and planning. These systems did not arise from foresight, but from the exhaustion of being surprised by the same problem repeatedly. Authority itself was weakened by a misunderstanding of obedience. Rulers believed compliance meant agreement, when it often meant endurance. People followed rules outwardly while adapting privately. This gap created parallel systems, informal markets, local customs, and unwritten laws that proved more resilient than official structures. When central authority later tried to enforce uniformity, it encountered resistance, not because people rejected order, but because they already had one that worked better for them. Even the medieval understanding of time favored repetition over progression. Cycles of seasons, prayers, and obligations reinforced the sense that life moved in circles rather than forward. This made long-term innovation feel unnecessary or even suspicious. Yet within these cycles, small variations crept in, slightly different tools, altered routes, new habits. Because these changes did not disrupt the cycle, they were accepted. Over centuries, repetition became the vehicle for transformation. Perhaps one of the most human medieval mistakes was assuming that intention mattered more than outcome. If a ruler meant well, harm was excused. If a law was morally framed, its consequences were overlooked. This allowed damaging policies to persist under the shelter of good intentions. Only when suffering became undeniable did outcomes begin to matter more than motives. This shift was slow, uneven, and incomplete, but it marked a crucial change in how responsibility was understood. What ties all these mistakes together is not ignorance, but limitation. Medieval people worked with narrow information, slow feedback, and immense uncertainty. Their errors were reasonable responses to those constraints, and because they lived with the consequences, they adjusted, not boldly, not deliberately, but persistently. Each correction was small, local, and often unrecorded, yet together they altered how people farmed, governed, believed, traded, and lived. In this way, medieval history is not a catalogue of errors to mock, but a reminder of how progress actually happens. It is slow, indirect, and usually invisible to those living through it. Change emerges, not when people fully understand the world, but when the cost of misunderstanding becomes too high to ignore. The medieval world changed because its mistakes were endured long enough to teach limits, and those limits quietly reshaped everything that came after. Another quiet misunderstanding that shaped medieval life was the belief that adaptation signaled weakness. Changing a practice was often seen as admitting failure or disrespecting ancestors. This mindset preserved customs long after they ceased to fit reality. Clothing styles ignored climate shifts. Building methods stayed unchanged despite repeated damage. And legal customs persisted even when they created injustice. Yet necessity forced people to adapt in small, unofficial ways, altering routines, bending rules, making exceptions. These unofficial adjustments slowly became normal, and what once seemed radical eventually felt traditional. Change succeeded, not by confronting tradition directly, but by quietly becoming part of it. Medieval societies also misunderstood the relationship between scarcity and cooperation. In times of shortage, leaders often assumed competition was inevitable and tightened control. In reality, survival frequently depended on informal sharing networks, mutual aid, and trust built outside official structures. Authorities rarely recognized these systems, sometimes even undermining them through rigid enforcement. Yet these quiet networks preserved communities through repeated crises. When formal institutions later expanded welfare or public support, they unknowingly borrowed from practices that had already proven effective at the margins. There was also a persistent error in how medieval people understood innovation's pace. They expected new ideas to arrive fully formed, clear, and immediately useful. Partial solutions or imperfect tools were dismissed as failures. This discouraged experimentation, yet experimentation continued quietly in workshops, fields, and households. Tools were modified bit by bit, techniques adjusted incrementally. Because no single change seemed impressive, progress remained invisible. Only when someone later combined these small improvements did the result appear revolutionary, masking the long chain of trial and error beneath it. Mistakes about loyalty further shaped political life. Allegiance was treated as permanent, yet it was often conditional and situational. Lords assumed devotion from vassals, who were simply calculating survival. When loyalty shifted, betrayal was blamed rather than misunderstanding. This pattern forced rulers to rely less on personal bonds and more on institutions, incentives, and enforcement. The rise of standing administrations and paid officials emerged not from trust in systems, but from disappointment in people. Medieval attitudes toward suffering also carried quiet consequences. Hardship was seen as inevitable and character building, which helped people endure extreme conditions, but also normalize preventable pain. Unsafe labor, poor housing, and inadequate care persisted because endurance was praised. Over generations, however, the cost of this mindset became too high. Gradual improvements in safety, health, and living conditions emerged not from compassion alone, but from the realization that constant suffering weakened societies. Again, change came not from moral clarity, but from accumulated loss. Another overlooked mistake lay in assuming that scale did not change meaning. Practices that worked in small villages were applied to growing towns and cities without adjustment. Customs that relied on personal familiarity failed when populations expanded. Crime, sanitation, and governance problems multiplied because systems built for hundreds were stretched to thousands. The response was not immediate reform, but improvisation, watch groups, local ordinances, and specialized roles. Over time, these improvisations became formal institutions, reshaping urban life without any single founding moment. Even the medieval understanding of knowledge ownership was flawed. Ideas were tied to status rather than merit. A noble's opinion carried more weight than a skilled worker's observation. This slowed learning, but also created pressure. When reality contradicted authority too often, authority itself had to adapt. Practical knowledge slowly gained recognition, not because hierarchies collapsed, but because ignoring effectiveness became too costly. The elevation of experience alongside learning emerged from repeated embarrassment rather than enlightenment. Perhaps most quietly, medieval people misunderstood how deeply everyday habits shape history. They believed history was made by kings, wars, and miracles. Another silent current running through medieval history was the misunderstanding of trust. Communities placed immense faith in oaths, symbols, and reputation, believing honor to be a stable and measurable quality. Yet honor was subjective and easily manipulated. Lords broke promises when convenient. Monasteries altered charters to protect land claims, and witnesses reshaped testimony to fit local loyalties. These small betrayals rarely caused immediate collapse, but over time they eroded confidence in personal guarantees and pushed societies toward written contracts, seals, and bureaucratic verification. What later looked like the rise of impersonal administration was actually a response to centuries of quiet disappointment in human reliability. There was also a persistent mistake in how medieval societies understood children and learning. Childhood was often seen as a brief, incomplete stage of adulthood, rather than a distinct period of development. As a result, education was uneven, harsh, and easily interrupted by labor or crisis. Skills were learned late, forgotten easily, and passed on inconsistently. This slowed the accumulation of expertise across generations. Yet when demographic shocks like plagues reduced populations, the scarcity of skilled adults forced more deliberate teaching, apprenticeships, and written manuals. The correction came not from new philosophy, but from the failure of the old assumption that knowledge would somehow take care of itself. Misjudgments about distance also shaped perception and power. Journeys that took weeks or months made distant places feel unreal or exaggerated. Rulers imagined control over territories they barely understood, issuing orders that made sense only on parchment. Local officials adapted these commands to reality, creating hybrid systems that bore little resemblance to central plans. Over time, this gap between intention and execution became normalized, laying the groundwork for regional autonomy and later concepts of local governance. Empires appeared unified on maps, but in practice they functioned through tolerated disobedience born from logistical misunderstanding. Another quiet error lay in how medieval people interpreted success. When harvests were good or wars were won, credit was often given to divine favor rather than human choice. This reduced incentive to analyze why something worked. Successful methods were repeated blindly, even when conditions changed. Failure, by contrast, prompted reflection only after it became unbearable. This imbalance meant societies learned more from catastrophe than from prosperity, creating a historical rhythm where progress followed collapse rather than preventing it. Gender roles were also reinforced through assumption rather than necessity. Many tasks were divided along lines believed to be natural, even when evidence showed overlap and flexibility. Women managed estates, ran businesses, and preserved knowledge during absences caused by war or pilgrimage. Yet these contributions were framed as temporary or exceptional. Because they were not formally acknowledged, their methods were rarely recorded, causing future generations to repeat work already mastered. The correction of this mistake came slowly and unevenly, but the survival of households and economies depended on these unrecognized adaptations. The medieval understanding of conflict resolution was similarly flawed. Violence was often seen as a cleansing or decisive act, yet most disputes lingered unresolved beneath temporary truces. Feuds paused rather than ended, and resentment passed quietly through generations. This created long memories of grievance that shaped alliances and hostilities centuries later. What later historians labelled ancient rivalries were often the compounded result of unresolved medieval misunderstandings, kept alive through habit rather than necessity. Even the senses were mistrusted in favour of inherited belief. Observation was secondary to explanation, already accepted. If something looked wrong but fit tradition, tradition prevailed. This discouraged experimentation while encouraging elaborate rationalizations. Yet cracks slowly appeared as contradictions multiplied. People adjusted practice without changing belief, creating a gap between what was said and what was done. This gap widened until belief itself had to change, but only after practice made the old explanation impossible to maintain. Perhaps most quietly of all, medieval people misunderstood the pace of history. They believed meaningful change happened rarely in dramatic moments ordained by higher forces. Because of this, they overlooked the power of accumulation. Each small adjustment felt insignificant, each compromise temporary, yet together, these tiny shifts transformed governance, economy, belief, and daily life. When later generations looked back, they saw a different world and struggled to explain how it came to be. The answer lies not in a single awakening reform or collapse, but in centuries of living with error. Medieval history advanced through misjudgment tolerated long enough to reveal its limits, then corrected just enough to keep going. It was a slow dialogue between assumption and reality, carried out quietly in fields, workshops, courts, monasteries, and homes. The medieval world did not intend to change history, yet by repeatedly getting things slightly wrong and surviving the consequences, it shaped the future more deeply than any flawless plan ever could. Another quiet but powerful medieval mistake was the assumption that stability meant correctness. If a system endured for generations, people believed it must be right, not merely resilient. This belief protected inefficient institutions long past their usefulness. Tax systems that drained productivity, legal customs that delayed justice, and military obligations that exhausted populations persisted because they had not yet caused total collapse. Survival was mistaken for success. Only when pressures accumulated beyond endurance did reform occur, and even then it appeared reactive rather than visionary. This pattern created a world that changed slowly, not because people resisted improvement, but because they misunderstood endurance as proof of wisdom. There was also a deep misunderstanding of coordination. Medieval societies relied heavily on local solutions, assuming that if each community managed itself, the whole would function well enough. This worked in isolation, but failed during widespread crises, famines, plagues, and wars, exposed how poorly connected systems truly were. Grain rotted in one region, while people starved in another because no mechanism existed to move resources efficiently. These failures were not seen as structural problems, but as tragic coincidences. Only after repeated disasters did broader administrative coordination emerge, quietly transforming governance without ever announcing a new philosophy of management. Even conflict between faith and practice was often ignored rather than resolved. Ideals preached restraint, charity, and humility, while daily survival required compromise, competition, and sometimes cruelty. Instead of reconciling these contradictions, medieval society normalized them. People lived with moral tension, explaining it away through confession or ritual, rather than systemic change. This allowed institutions to continue functioning, despite ethical inconsistency, but it also delayed reform. When change finally came, it felt morally urgent because the gap between belief and behavior had grown too wide to ignore. Mistakes about communication shaped power in subtle ways. Public announcements were rare, literacy limited, and rumor filled the gaps. Authorities underestimated how quickly distorted information could spread and how deeply it could shape behavior. A misunderstood decree could spark resistance or compliance based on fear rather than intent. Over time, rulers learned, slowly, that control required clarity. The emergence of standardized proclamations, town criers, and later printed notices was not a cultural revolution, but a response to centuries of being misunderstood. The medieval view of work also carried quiet error. Labour was seen primarily as obligation rather than process. Effort mattered more than outcome. If someone worked hard, failure was accepted as fate. This discouraged efficiency and experimentation. Only when labour shortages forced change did output begin to matter more than effort itself. Tools were improved, methods refined, and time managed differently. These shifts were practical responses to necessity, not ideological commitments to productivity, yet they permanently altered economic life. Another misconception lay in the treatment of margins. Borderlands, minority groups, and unconventional thinkers were seen as peripheral and unimportant. Yet these edges were often where adaptation happened fastest. People living between cultures learned flexibility, translation, and negotiation out of necessity. Their solutions spread quietly when central systems failed. Because these contributions came from the margins, they were rarely credited, but they shaped resilience more than centralized authority ever did. Medieval people also misunderstood recovery. After disasters, rebuilding aimed to restore the past, rather than improve upon it. Houses were rebuilt where floods had already proven them unsafe. Crops were replanted in depleted soil. Trade routes were reopened despite repeated vulnerability. This desire to return to what was known delayed adaptation. Yet each reconstruction included tiny changes, stronger walls, different materials, altered timing, that accumulated into improvement despite intent. Progress arrived disguised as restoration. Perhaps the most persistent mistake was believing that the future would resemble the past closely enough to prepare for it the same way. Planning was short, term, reactive, and rooted. Another overlooked force shaping medieval history through quiet mistake was the way authority was confused with truth. If an idea came from a king, bishop, or ancient scholar, it carried weight regardless of evidence. This meant that once an incorrect belief was endorsed by power, it became nearly impossible to challenge. Entire generations accepted flawed ideas about the human body, the natural world, and society simply because questioning them felt dangerous or pointless. This slowed correction, but it also created stability, allowing societies to function without constant ideological conflict. When corrections finally came, they felt sudden and disruptive, even though the pressure for change had been building silently for centuries. Mistakes in inheritance law quietly redirected the flow of wealth and power. When heirs died unexpectedly, or records were unclear, land passed to distant relatives, monasteries, or the crown. These transfers were often treated as unfortunate accidents, yet they reshaped political landscapes by concentrating or fragmenting power. Over time, entire regions came under ecclesiastical or royal control, not through conquest, but through clerical errors, missing documents, or misunderstood customs. What looked like divine providence or royal destiny was often the result of administrative confusion. Even warfare logistics suffered from persistent misjudgment. Armies underestimated how much food, fodder, and time campaigns required. Soldiers starved, not because enemies blocked supplies, but because planners assumed ideal conditions. Repeated logistical failures forced armies to live off the land, devastating civilian populations and altering settlement patterns. Villages were abandoned not after battles, but after repeated temporary requisitions that became permanent destruction. These slow changes reshaped demographics far more than famous wars ever did. In religion, the line between symbolism and literal belief was often blurred. Metaphors intended to teach moral lessons were gradually treated as physical truth. This shaped attitudes toward the afterlife, sin and salvation, creating deep emotional responses to ideas that were never meant to be interpreted so rigidly. Fear-based devotion became normalized, influencing behavior more strongly than doctrine itself. The emotional weight of these misunderstandings structured daily life, from work rhythms to family decisions, without any official decree. Technological stagnation was sometimes the result of mistaken confidence rather than ignorance. When a tool worked well enough, improvement felt unnecessary or even suspicious. Watermills, for example, were adopted unevenly because some communities believed existing methods were sufficient. This delayed productivity gains in some regions, while others surged ahead, creating long-term economic imbalance that later appeared natural or deserved. The difference often came down not to intelligence or resources, but to willingness to admit that the old way might be flawed. Errors in moral judgment also shaped social exclusion. Poverty was frequently treated as a moral failure rather than an economic condition. This belief justified neglect and punishment instead of reform. Yet repeated crises, especially after plagues and famines, made this view increasingly difficult to maintain. Slowly, systems of charity, hospitals, and communal aid emerged not from compassion alone, but from the practical failure of blaming individuals for structural hardship. Again, progress emerged from the exhaustion of a bad idea rather than the triumph of a good one. Perhaps the quietest medieval mistake was the assumption that humans had little control over their circumstances. Fate, fortune, and divine explained nearly everything. This belief reduced panic during disasters, but it also delayed proactive solutions. When people finally began to act as if planning mattered, they did not announce a new worldview. They simply adjusted habits, laws, and expectations. These small changes accumulated until society operated on an entirely different logic than before. By the end of the medieval period, the world had changed profoundly, yet few people would have pointed to a single moment when it happened. There was no clear break, no universal awakening. Instead, there was a long trail of quiet mistakes, slowly recognized, partially corrected, and then replaced with better ones. Medieval history was not a story of ignorance giving way to knowledge, but of humans learning, again and again, that certainty is fragile. In that fragile space between confidence and correction, the foundations of the modern world were laid. not through perfection, but through the patient accumulation of being wrong, and surviving long enough to adapt. One more subtle way medieval mistakes reshaped history lies in how societies misunderstood risk. Danger was often judged by tradition or fear rather than probability. People feared eclipses, comets, and unusual births far more than contaminated water, poor sanitation, or malnutrition. Because of this, enormous energy was spent interpreting omens while slow. Invisible threats were ignored. Cities invested in walls and relics while neglecting clean water systems, and the resulting disease cycles quietly determined population growth, labor availability, and urban survival. Over time, repeated crises forced reluctant improvements, but always after damage had already been done. Knowledge loss itself was one of the medieval era's most influential mistakes. Libraries burned, manuscripts decayed, and skills disappeared when a single expert died without passing them on. These losses were rarely recognized as catastrophic at the time. They felt local and temporary, yet when entire crafts, medical techniques, or engineering methods vanished, later generations had to reinvent what was already known centuries earlier. This created the illusion of progress through discovery, when in reality it was recovery from neglect. The rhythm of advance and regression shaped how quickly societies could build upon past achievements. Social norms were equally shaped by misunderstanding human behavior. Authorities believed order depended on strict control and visible punishment. Assuming fear produced stability, while this sometimes worked short-term, it also bred quiet resistance, evasion, and alternative networks of loyalty. Peasants learned how to hide grain, merchants learned how to bypass restrictions, and communities developed informal systems stronger than official law. These hidden adaptations slowly weakened centralized authority without open rebellion, preparing the ground for later political change. Mistakes about education priorities had long-term consequences as well. Instruction focused heavily on theology and rhetoric, while practical knowledge, engineering, agriculture, mechanics, was learned informally and rarely recorded. This separation meant that useful innovations spread slowly and unevenly. When practical knowledge finally entered written tradition, it transformed learning rapidly, but only after centuries of lost opportunity. The delay was not due to lack of intelligence, but to a mistaken hierarchy of what counted as real knowledge. Even emotions were misunderstood in ways that shaped history. Grief, trauma, and fear were interpreted as spiritual tests rather than psychological experiences. Communities normalized suffering instead of addressing its causes. While this provided meaning during hardship, it also dulled urgency for reform. Wars resumed, plagues returned, and exploitation continued because pain was expected rather than questioned. Over generations, however, accumulated exhaustion forced changes in labor rights, welfare, and governance, not from idealism, but from the failure of endurance itself. Geopolitical boundaries were often the result of compounded misunderstandings rather than strategic design. Borders followed rivers believed to be permanent, mountains assumed to be impassable, or agreements based on vague descriptions. When environments changed or interpretations differed, conflict followed. These disputes hardened into national identities, meaning that future generations inherited rivalries born from medieval guesswork rather than ancient inevitability. Perhaps the most ironic medieval mistake was the belief that the age itself was living in decline from a better past. This mindset discouraged confidence in innovation and reinforced reverence for tradition. Yet despite believing they were preserving a fading world, medieval people continuously altered it. Tools improved, systems adapted, and social structures shifted quietly beneath the weight of everyday necessity. Because change was unintended, it was rarely celebrated, but it was relentless. In the end, medieval history is not best understood as a time of darkness or enlightenment, but as a long negotiation with error. People acted with limited information, trusted what they inherited, and adjusted only when reality forced them to. Those adjustments, small, imperfect, and often unacknowledged, accumulated into transformation. The medieval world did not change because it planned to, nor because it understood itself clearly, but because human beings kept making mistakes and then learning just enough from them to move forward. What feels quiet in the past is often what mattered most. At an even deeper level, medieval history was shaped by mistakes about human memory itself. People believed that important knowledge would naturally be remembered and passed down, underestimating how fragile oral tradition could be. When elders died during wars or plagues, entire bodies of local knowledge vanished with them. Farming techniques suited to specific soils, flood patterns of nearby rivers, medicinal plant uses, and conflict, avoidance customs between neighbouring communities. These losses forced later generations to relearn,